Democratic election in the Middle East since the election of Hamas in Gaza. And immediately the enemies of Egypt began setting about to overthrow the Muslim Brotherhood. The biggest mistake that the Brotherhood made was, well, the two biggest ones was first not getting a good public relations agent in the United States to tell Americans that these people were not devils and were not working for Osama bin Laden. And the second thing was that they didn't purge the Egyptian government, because when they took power, all ministries of the government, the secret police, the security police, the foreign ministry, the education ministry, the courts, the universities, were all in the hands of the Mubarak clique. And what they did was completely sabotage the Muslim Brotherhood government, so it could do nothing. It had none of the organs of power. And eventually, it was, of course, as we know, overthrown. To me, having once lived in Egypt, I find it doubly tragic, because we are seeing what I fear may be the reappearance of an Arab fascism in Egypt that we saw develop in Lebanon first in the 1930s, and then in the 1980s when I was covering the civil war there, and we saw the phalangists suddenly pop up again, who had been modeled after Mussolini's black shirts in the 1930s. But now we see an Egyptian military regime, brutal, that is taking orders from foreign countries and is behaving in the most undemocratic manner that we can imagine. And it's a tragedy that the rest of the Muslim world should not allow to happen, certainly should not encourage. We see the new, well, let me cover Iraq, as has been mentioned, has been destroyed. I covered Iraq extensively, and you know, before the U.S. invaded Iraq, I remember I was at a dinner one night, private dinner in Aspen, Colorado, with some of the most highly placed people in the American government, Bush administration, Papa Bush administration. And one of them turned to me and said, well, Eric, you know all about the Middle East. Explain Iraq to us. And I started to talk, and I started talking about the Sunnis and Shiites, Kurds, and on and on. And I could see the eyes of these officials glazing over with incomprehension. And one of them finally turned to me and he said, John, give us the bottom line. And I said, sir, there is no bottom line. The message that I have for you is don't get involved. But we know that America foolishly did get involved, pushed into the war by a self-serving clique in Washington and by a media that allowed itself to become a mouthpiece for the government. And the result is the destruction of the second most important Arab country. Iraq has been destroyed as a potential enemy of Israel. Iraq has been completely destroyed. It will not rebuild for a very long time. And what's important is that Iraq is still, though free from American military occupation, there is an American influence there. First of all, a huge embassy and special forces, but also the fact that there's almost an American Army division just down the road in Kuwait, ready to intervene at any moment in Iraq. Secondly, the U.S. still can control the airspace over Iraq, and as we saw from previous wars, he who controls the air controls everything on the ground. And American air bases all around the area that can intervene. Iraq is not allowed to have a real air force. So Iraq is kind of a quasi-country. There's still millions of Iraqi refugees left. Syria, we see the agony, we've just been talking about it. Syria is being destroyed. Syria is being destroyed because Syria, which was on very good terms with Western powers, refused to join the crusade against Iran. And for this sin, Syria was punished. That was not a spontaneous revolution that began in Syria. It was a pre-planned uprising, the same as happened in Libya. Some popular demonstrations were quickly turned into major fighting. And the governments, both in Libya and in Syria, reacted foolishly, overly harshly, didn't address the problems that were making people angry, and again, were too repressive, and we know the results. So we have Syria, which is, Damascus is the oldest city supposedly in the world. We have another heart of the Arab world torn open. Libya is a mess, as we know. There's no government, it's in chaos. Not that the last government of Gaddafi was a model of good governance, but Gaddafi was crazy. I know I spent a good deal of time with him in Tripoli, and in fact, I've had a few people who say he's held hands with Gaddafi. But eccentric as he was, Gaddafi, at least he ran the country. You know, there was people went to school, people had enough food, which is more than you can say about some of the countries in the region. Finally, we see Sudan now broken into two parts, and we see Somalia. Poor Somalia, you know, the Somalis have been fighting. They started fighting the British in the 19th century, and they've been fighting ever since. And unfortunately, the only halfway decent government they had there in the mid-1990s, the Islamic Courts Union, was overthrown by the U.S. and the Ethiopians. So we Americans, have a lot to blame. But what's so interesting about this is that suddenly this interest in these countries and the new interest, U.S. interest in Africa, Uganda, in Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, is that there is believed to be oil in all of these places. You know, America is now becoming an oil exporter because of fracking. So America does not desperately rely on imported oil anymore. It's got Canada to provide lots and lots of oil. Canada has more oil than Saudi Arabia. It's dirty oil, but it's there. But the U.S., you have to understand the mentality of the United States regarding oil. Oil for us is the holy grail. It's more important than blood. America in the 19th century was the world's largest producer of oil. And America won World War II. I mean, this idea is ingrained in the mentality of the American strategic thinkers, the military. America won World War II because of oil. Germany and Japan lost World War II because they didn't have oil. Amazingly, one great quote, Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had been educated in the United States, he said in 1940-41, he said, we, Japan, are going to war with the United States for oil, because they wanted oil in this region. But I fear we are going to be defeated because of oil. And of course he was exactly right, because by June 1944, the United States submarine fleets had completely blockaded Japan, cutting off 99% of all shipments going into Japan. The Japanese fleet sat in harbor, couldn't put to sea because they had no fuel oil. Japanese Air Force couldn't take off because they had no aviation fuel. All imports of food and raw materials were stopped. Japan was brought to its knees a year and a half before the dropping of the atomic bombs. Japan was literally defeated that quickly. The Germans began World War II. They had only two sources of oil. One was Ploesti in Romania, and the second was making oil from coal, a synthetic fuel. And its oil plants were bombed by the Americans. The Germans never had enough fuel. At the end of the war, the Germans had over 200 of these new ME-262 jets, which would have swept the skies of all enemy planes, but they couldn't fly because they had no aviation fuel. In 1940, Germany's sole source of aviation fuel was the United States. Crazily enough, Germany's other important ally, Italy, its source of oil was Germany. And so the Italian fleet could never put to sea. They did it, I think, twice or three times. But they almost ran out of gas when they went out to sea, so they had to come back, and they spent the rest of the war sitting in port. So the Americans realized that oil is determination. He who has oil is going to be the world power. And it's not just having oil for your own armies and factories, but he who controls oil controls the rest of the world. The American domination of the Middle East means that America has control over Europe and over Japan. And that's America's fixed idea, and America has never wavered from that. Now, the interesting new thing is America's creeping intervention into Black Africa, an area that nobody cared about before. But suddenly we see the birth of the new U.S. Africa Command. The U.S. has divided the world into 6 military zones. And this is the hot new one that everybody wants to join. It only has 2,500 people with it, and only has a meager budget of $257 million, but it is the framework for future U.S. intervention in Africa. And again, it's being driven by oil because most of the American interest is in countries with potential oil sources. Secondly, by Chinese competition. And third, by the fact that the Americans, the withdrawal from, or the partial withdrawal from Afghanistan, the end of the war in Iraq, has left the U.S. military with itching for some new conflicts. You know, all generals want, soldiers want conflicts. That's how they get promoted. So there's this renewed interest in Africa. The U.S. is building rapidly a very important base in Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa, Camp Lemonnier, which is going to serve for the base for U.S. drones, special forces, fighting. The U.S. is now fully at war with Shabab in Somalia. It's fighting in Yemen. It's got troops and special forces in Uganda and Kenya. It's hand in glove with the Ethiopians. It's getting very involved.